The wind, a hollow voice through skeletal trees, clawed at him. Dust, gritty as regret, stung his eyes. He tasted iron, the tang of old blood, or perhaps just the parched earth itself, carried on that relentless breath. Silas. The name felt like a borrowed coat, ill-fitting and heavy. He pulled the collar of his own threadbare jacket tighter, a futile gesture against a chill that seeped deeper than bone. Each step was a calculation, a gamble against the ghosts of his own making and the men who hunted him. The sun, a merciless eye in the bleached sky, offered no comfort, only exposure. He sought shadow, the mercy of ruin. This town, a name erased from maps, whispered promises of such oblivion. Houses sagged, their windows vacant sockets, staring at a future that had forgotten them. Doors hung agape, inviting only the wind and the creatures that skittered in the dark. He moved like one of them, a shadow flitting between deeper shadows, senses raw. Thirst was a constant companion, hunger a dull ache, but the fire in his belly, the one he carried, burned hotter than any physical need. It was a destructive furnace, banked low for now, but ready. Always ready. He saw it then, through a veil of swirling dust and the shimmering heat haze. A spire, crooked and defiant, piercing the desolate horizon. A church, or what was left of one. The irony, a bitter taste, mixed with the dust. Churches, sanctuaries of a god he'd long since abandoned, or who had abandoned him. They were tinder and timber, hollow shells echoing with hypocrisies. He'd given them new songs, anthems of flame and crackling judgment, his offerings. The thought sent a familiar tremor through him, a ghost of the heat, the power. His hand, scarred and calloused, instinctively went to the small oilskin pouch at his belt. Inside, the means. Flint, steel, tinder, the trinity of his new faith. He approached with the caution of a wolf, circling, testing the air. The building was small, wooden, its paint scoured away by time and tempest, leaving the bare wood silvered and vulnerable. One side of the roof had collapsed, a gaping wound opened to the sky. The bell tower, if it ever had a bell, was silent, its peak leaning precariously. Yet, it stood, a stubborn testament to something, or perhaps just too forgotten to fall completely. This would do, a fitting pyre for his own burning soul. He imagined the flames licking at the weathered planks, climbing the broken spire, a beacon in this forsaken land. A final, defiant shout into the indifferent void. He needed shelter for the night, a place to gather his resolve. The approaching dusk painted the landscape in hues of bruised purple and blood orange. The wind picked up, its mournful song intensifying. A storm was coming. He could feel it in the air, a tension that mirrored his own. He'd wait for the storm to pass. Then, the purification. He moved towards the chapel, his silhouette merging with the encroaching darkness, a harbinger of a different kind of storm, one he carried within himself, one he was eager to unleash. The door, surprisingly, was not locked, not even fully closed. It creaked open under his touch, a sound that echoed like a moan in the vast emptiness. He slipped inside, into the gloom, the scent of dry rot, ancient dust, and something else, something unexpected. The air inside the chapel was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, and something unexpectedly clean. Not the sterile clean of polish and incense he remembered from childhood churches, the kind that always felt like a lie, but a swept clean. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through a grimy, unbroken pane of glass in one window and the gaping hole in the roof, he saw it. A small section of the floor, near what must have once been the altar, was clear of debris, swept. The dust motes danced in the single shaft of light, illuminating the worn wooden floorboards. He froze, his hand already reaching for the tinder pouch, stilled. This wasn't the complete abandonment he'd anticipated. Someone had been here, recently. His hunter's instinct, honed by months on the run, screamed. He scanned the shadows, heart hammering against his ribs. Was it a trap? Had they tracked him even to this god-forsaken place? He held his breath, listening. only the wind sighing through the broken roof, the distant rumble of the approaching storm. Then, a flicker, not of flame, but of movement, in the deepest shadows beyond the dilapidated altar. He squinted, his body tensing, coiling like a spring. A shape, small, hunched, still. He took a tentative step, the floorboard groaning beneath his boot. The sound was an explosion in the silence. The shape didn't react. Slowly, his eyes resolved the form. A woman. She was sitting on the floor, back against the far wall, knees drawn to her chest. Her head was bowed, hair like a dark spill hiding her face. She wore simple, dark clothing, practical and worn, blending into the twilight of the chapel. He could see the outline of a rough blanket pooled around her. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Not a threat then. A vagrant, like him, seeking shelter. But why here? In this ruin? And the swept floor? He watched her for a long moment. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. Was she asleep? Injured? Dead? No. He could see the faint rise and fall of her shoulder. Breathing. Alive. His purpose, the fire he'd come to light, felt suddenly complicated. He hadn't factored this in. A witness. A complication he didn't need. He could scare her off. A shout. A threat. She looked frail enough, but the silence of the place, her own profound stillness, gave him pause. He felt like an intruder, not on a building, but on something sacred, though he couldn't name what. He moved further into the chapel, his boots crunching softly on fallen plaster and dirt, deliberately avoiding the swept patch. He needed a place to rest, to wait out the storm. He found a relatively intact pew near the back, away from her, and sank onto it. The wood was cold, unyielding. He kept his eyes on her. Still no movement. Who was she? What was her story? This place, forgotten by the world, had become her refuge, and he had come to destroy it. The thought sat uneasily with him now. The storm outside was drawing closer. The wind howled with greater fury, rattling the loose timbers of the chapel. Rain began to fall, a few heavy drops at first, then a steady drumming on the remaining roof. Silas shivered, though not entirely from cold. The woman finally stirred. She lifted her head slowly, as if waking from a deep trance or carrying a great weight. Her face, when it turned towards the dim light, was etched with a sorrow so profound it seemed to carve the very bones beneath her skin. Yet, there was no fear in her eyes as they found him, only a deep, weary acknowledgement. Her eyes, they were the color of the storm-tossed sky, gray and vast, holding ancient rains. He saw no accusation, no alarm, just a quiet observation that stripped him bare. He, Silas, the man of fire and flight, felt suddenly transparent, his violent intent a crude scrawl on his soul for her to read. He shifted uncomfortably on the pew. He expected a scream, a question, a plea. She offered none. Instead, she rose, not quickly, but with a deliberate grace that seemed out of place in her ragged appearance and the surrounding ruin. She was taller than he'd thought, slender, but with a resilience in her posture, like a reed that bends in the wind but does not break. She moved towards the swept area near the altar, her bare feet making no sound on the dusty floor. There, she knelt. Not to him, but towards the broken altar, towards the gaping hole in the roof that now let in streaks of rain like silver tears, and she began to pray. He couldn't hear words. Her lips moved, but no sound escaped. It was a silent communion, a conversation with an unseen presence in the heart of desolation. Her hands, clasped before her, were rough, like his own, but they moved with a reverence that made his own hands, stained with soot and malice, feel clumsy and profane. He watched, a knot tightening in his chest. This was not the welcome he'd envisioned. No terror, no confrontation. Just this silent, unwavering devotion in the face of his looming threat. He felt a flicker of his old anger. Was this a mockery? A performance? But her absorption was too complete, her sorrow too genuine. The rain lashed down harder, drumming a furious rhythm. Water began to drip steadily from new leaks in the roof. One stream landed near her, spattering her dark dress. She didn't flinch, didn't break her silent prayer. He should do it now. Scare her away. Take out his tinder. Let her see his intent. Let her fear fuel the flames. That was how it worked. Fear, then fire, then oblivion. But the image of her, kneeling in the encroaching damp, her silent words aimed at a heaven that seemed as broken as this chapel, held him captive. He found he couldn't move, couldn't speak. His own voice, usually a rasp of command or a muttered curse, felt trapped in his throat. The fire he carried, the one that had been his constant companion, his terrible purpose, felt dampened, choked by the unexpected sanctity of this ruin, by the presence of this silent, praying woman. She finished her prayer, or perhaps merely paused. She rose, turned, and looked directly at him again. Then, she did something that shattered his remaining composure. She walked towards a small, hidden alcove he hadn't noticed, retrieved a tin cup and a small, rough loaf of bread. She approached him, her steps measured, unafraid. She held them out, an offering. To him, the arsonist, the fugitive, the man who had come to burn her sanctuary. He stared at the bread, the water. His throat was a desert, his stomach a hollow cavern, but it wasn't just hunger or thirst that made him hesitate. It was the sheer, unadulterated humanity of the gesture, an act of grace in a place he'd marked for destruction, from a woman he'd intended to terrify. He remembered another offering, long ago. A small carved bird, clutched in a child's hand. His daughter, Alara. No, not Alara, that was this woman's name in his mind, but Lily. Lily, with eyes like summer cornflowers and a laugh that could charm the birds from the trees. She had offered him the bird, whittled by her own small hands, the day before the fire. His fire. Not the ones he set for others, the ones that were meant to purge and punish, but the accidental one. The one born of a dropped lamp, a drunken stupor, a moment of careless rage after Martha, his wife, had finally left, her own spirit scorched by his simmering fury. He'd been arguing with himself, with her ghost, with the bottle. The lamp fell. The curtains, dry as tinder, had inhaled the flame. He remembered the smoke, thick and acrid, the sudden, roaring heat. He remembered stumbling out, coughing, his eyes streaming, the crackle of the blaze already a deafening monster. And then the realization, a cold dread that extinguished even the heat of the flames. Lily. He had screamed her name, tried to go back in, but the neighbors, alerted by the inferno, held him back. The roof caved in with a sound like the world ending. Lily. Gone. Consumed. He hadn't meant for that. He had never meant for that. The town, their town, had turned on him. Accusations flew. Murderer. Monster. He hadn't stayed to defend himself. What defense was there? He ran, and the fire inside him, the guilt, the grief, it twisted. It became something else. A need to see other things burn, perhaps. A twisted reflection of his own internal immolation. If he was a monster, he would be the monster they proclaim. He would bring the fire. He would make them understand what it felt like to lose everything to the flames. So he burned. Empty barns at first. Then symbols of their hypocrisy. The corrupt magistrate's office. The greedy merchant's warehouse. The abandoned church on the outskirts of another town, where they'd preached damnation and offered no solace. Each fire was a scream, a desperate, inarticulate cry against the injustice of his own suffering, his own guilt. Each blaze a temporary relief, quickly followed by a deeper, colder emptiness. He became a whisper, a legend of the night, the ash bringer, hunted, alone, fueled by a rage that consumed him as surely as any physical flame. And now this woman, with her silent offering, her eyes that held no judgment, only a profound, shared sorrow. He looked from her face to the bread in her hand. His own hands trembled. Not with the eagerness to ignite, but with a different, unfamiliar tremor. The memory of Lily, of the little carved bird, of the life he had incinerated, washed over him, as cold and drenching as the rain now pouring through the chapel roof. He took the bread. His fingers brushed hers. Her skin was cool, surprisingly soft. The bread was coarse, slightly stale, but it tasted like salvation. The water in the tin cup, likely collected from the rain, was sweet and cool, washing away some of the dust and bitterness that coated his tongue. She watched him, her expression unreadable but for that pervasive sorrow. When he finished, he looked at her, a question in his eyes. He wanted to ask her name, why she was here, why she wasn't afraid, but the words wouldn't form. His voice, so long used for harsh commands or solitary curses, felt rusted shut. She seemed to understand. She gestured to herself, then touched her lips and shook her head slightly, mute or choosing silence. It didn't matter. Her silence spoke more eloquently than any words he'd heard in years. She then gestured around the dilapidated chapel, a sweep of her hand that encompassed the broken altar, the leaking roof, the gathering gloom. Her home, her sanctuary. He found himself nodding, a slow acknowledgement. He understood seeking refuge in ruins. He was a ruin himself. The storm raged outside, a symphony of wind and water. Inside, an uneasy truce settled. She returned to her spot near the altar, pulling her thin blanket tighter. He remained on the pew, the tinder pouch at his belt suddenly feeling heavy, alien. He watched her. She didn't try to engage him further, didn't stare. She simply existed, a quiet presence in the maelstrom. Occasionally, her lips would move in that silent prayer. Praying for what? For the storm to pass? For deliverance? For him? The thought was absurd. Yet, it lodged in his mind. He dozed fitfully, waking with a start each time a louder gust of wind shook the fragile structure, or a piece of plaster fell. Each time, his eyes went to her. She was always there, a still point in the chaos. Sometimes her eyes were closed, as if in meditation. Other times, they were open, gazing towards the altar, or up at the tempestuous sky, visible through the hole in the roof. He found himself observing the details of her existence. The way she carefully conserved her meager resources, the neat stack of firewood in a dry corner, the few pathetic-looking roots or herbs laid out on a flat stone, presumably for a future meal. There was a strange order to her desolation, a dignity. He saw a small, smooth stone on the altar, and beside it, a single tattered feather, perhaps from a hawk or an owl. Offerings? Or just things she found beautiful? His gaze kept returning to the tinder pouch. The urge to burn was deeply ingrained, a twisted instinct. This place, this woman, they were an anomaly, a disruption to the narrative of destruction he had written for himself. He should stick to the plan, wait for the storm to break, then light the fire. Erase this place, erase her quiet challenge to his rage. But the bread she had given him still sat in his stomach, a warmth that had nothing to do with fire. Her silent presence was a mirror, reflecting not the monster he had become, but the man he had been, the man who had loved, and lost, and broken. The fire he carried felt less like a weapon now, more like a sickness, a fever he couldn't shake. He watched her as the first faint light of a stormy dawn began to filter through the grimy window. Her face, in the pale light, looked even more worn, etched with lines of hardship. But her eyes, when she opened them and they met his, still held that unwavering, sorrowful calm. He saw no hope in them, not for herself, perhaps, but no despair either, just acceptance. And in that acceptance, a strange kind of strength. He wondered about her silence. Was it trauma that had stolen her voice, or a choice? A renunciation of a world that had offered her nothing but pain? He saw a small, faded piece of cloth tucked into the side of her blanket, almost hidden. Once, when she shifted, he caught a glimpse of something embroidered on it, a crude flower, perhaps, or a child's initial, a remnant of a past life, like his own memories of Lily. He imagined her story. Perhaps she too had lost everything to a fire, or to a flood, or to the slow, grinding cruelty of poverty and neglect. Perhaps this ruined chapel was the only place she felt safe, the only place that wouldn't judge her, wouldn't demand anything of her, a place where her silence was understood, or at least not questioned. He thought of the towns he'd terrorized, the fear he'd sown. He told himself it was justice, a reckoning. But looking at her, at the quiet endurance etched on her face, he saw the hollowness of his crusade. What justice was there in adding more pain to a world already overflowing with it? What meaning in burning down another empty shell when human hearts were already so easily broken? The storm outside began to subside as morning advanced. The rain softened to a drizzle, the wind to a mournful sigh. The light inside the chapel grew stronger, revealing the true extent of the decay, but also the stubborn persistence of life in the woman's small corner. She rose and went to the leaking spots, placing old tins and broken pottery shards to catch the dripping water. A mundane task, performed with an almost ritualistic care. He watched her hands. They were chapped and stained with dirt, but they moved with purpose, tending to her broken sanctuary. His own hands, he realized, had only known how to destroy for so long. He couldn't remember the last time he'd built anything, fixed anything, nurtured anything. The fire. Always the fire. It had been his answer to everything. His voice, his power, his escape. But here, in the quiet presence of this mute woman, his fire felt like a childish tantrum, a destructive rage against a world that was mostly indifferent, and sometimes, as in her case, quietly, heartbreakingly resilient. He felt a stirring of something he hadn't felt in years. Shame, not just for Lily, but for all of it. For the path he'd chosen, the darkness he'd embraced. He looked at the tinder pouch again. The desire to burn, to unleash that familiar, destructive power, was still there, a cold knot in his gut. But it was weaker now, laced with doubt, with a profound weariness. What would it achieve? Another ruin in a world full of them, another scar on his already ravaged soul. And her. What about her? Would he drive her out into the desolate landscape, take away her only shelter, just to satisfy his dying rage? The thought left a taste like ash in his mouth. He had come here to burn a church. He had found a woman who, in her own silent way, seemed to embody the very essence of what a church was supposed to be. A refuge, a place of quiet contemplation, a testament to endurance in the face of desolation. He felt a sudden, absurd urge to protect it, to protect her from himself. The lull in the storm was deceptive. As midday approached, the sky darkened again, a bruised, angry purple. The wind returned with a vengeance, not just sighing now, but screaming, tearing at the already weakened structure of the chapel. Timbers groaned, and the hole in the roof seemed to widen with each new gust. The woman, Elara as he now firmly thought of her, stopped her quiet tasks. She stood near the altar, looking up at the tearing sky, her face pale but composed. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes then. Not fear for herself, he thought, but for this place, this fragile shell that was her world. Rain began to fall again, not in drops, but in sheets, driven almost horizontally by the wind. Water poured through the main hole in the roof, creating a muddy pool in the center of the chapel. New leaks sprang everywhere, a relentless assault. A loud crack echoed through the small building as a section of the remaining roof near the bell tower sagged ominously. Dust and debris rained down. Silas was on his feet, his own weariness forgotten, adrenaline surging. Instinct took over, the instinct to survive, but also something else, something new. He looked at Elara. She was still by the altar, her hands clasped, her lips moving in that silent prayer, but her eyes were fixed on the groaning timbers above. He saw it then, the real fear, not for herself, but for the potential collapse. Move! The word ripped from his throat, raw and unfamiliar. It was the first word he'd spoken to her, the first meaningful word he'd spoken to anyone in what felt like a lifetime. She startled, her eyes snapping to his. He didn't wait for her to react. He strode towards the weakest part of the wall, where the roof was threatening to give way completely. There was a pile of fallen beams and planks nearby, remnants of earlier collapses. He grabbed one, a heavy piece of timber, testing its strength. "Help me!" he yelled over the roar of the wind. He didn't know if she understood, or if she would, but he had to try. He looked back. She was moving, not away, but towards him, her eyes, wide in the stormy gloom, fixed on his with an intensity that matched the tempest outside. She pointed to another beam, then to a section of the wall that was visibly bowing inwards. She understood. Together, in the howling chaos, they worked. He, with his brute strength, she with a surprising wiriness and an intuitive understanding of the chapel's fragile structure. They dragged beams, propped them against the groaning walls, used flat stones as wedges. The rain soaked them to the bone. The wind threatened to tear them from their feet. It was a desperate, frantic battle against the elements, against the inevitable decay. He found himself shouting instructions, short, guttural commands. "Here, hold this, push!" And she responded, her silence no barrier to their shared purpose. Her hands, though smaller, were surprisingly strong, her movements economical and effective. They were no longer fugitive and hermit, arsonist and victim. They were two souls fighting to keep a fragile sanctuary from crumbling around them. At one point, a large section of the roof directly over the altar tore away with a sickening rip, crashing down onto the very spot where she usually knelt. If she had been there, the thought jolted him. He looked at her, her face streaked with mud and rain, her hair plastered to her skull. She just looked at the new gaping hole, then back at the task at hand, her expression grim but resolute. The fire within Silas, the one he'd nurtured for destruction, was now channeled into this desperate act of preservation. He felt its heat, but it was different now. Not a consuming rage, but a driving force, a raw energy bent on holding back the chaos. He felt alive in a way he hadn't since before Lily. Alive, and strangely, clean. The worst of the storm passed as dusk began to settle again, leaving behind a battered, sodden world. The chapel still stood, though barely. Water dripped from a dozen new places, and the wind still whistled through fresh gaps in the walls, but the immediate threat of collapse had receded. They had shored up the weakest points, a temporary reprieve bought with exhaustion and a strange, shared desperation. Silas slumped onto a damp pew, every muscle aching, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was soaked, cold, and utterly spent. Ilara leaned against the altar, her chest heaving. Her dark dress was torn, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes, when they met his across the gloomy space, held a new light. Not sorrow anymore, or not just sorrow, something like acknowledgement. Respect, perhaps, or maybe just shared survival. Silence descended again, broken only by the dripping water and their labored breathing. The tinder pouch at his belt was soaked through. Useless now, even if he'd wanted to use it. The irony was not lost on him. He had come to burn this place, and instead, he had fought to save it. He looked around at the makeshift repairs, the braced walls, the floor littered with fresh debris. It was still a ruin, perhaps even more so now. But it was their ruin, a place they had defended together. He felt a strange sense of ownership, of connection to this broken sanctuary, a feeling that was both unwelcome and undeniable. Ilara pushed herself away from the altar and slowly walked towards him. He tensed, unsure what to expect. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze steady. Then she did something that completely disarmed him. She knelt, not in prayer this time, but facing him. She reached out a hand, palm up, towards him. It was a gesture of, what? Gratitude? Truce? He didn't know. Her hand was trembling slightly. He looked at her face, really looked at it. The lines of hardship were still there, the weariness. But the profound sorrow that had seemed to define her was softened, overlaid with a fragile, emerging something else. Hope? No, that was too strong a word. But a quiet resilience, a spark of connection in her storm-gray eyes. He hesitated, then slowly he reached out his own hand, rough, scarred, the hand of an arsonist, and placed it in hers. Her fingers closed around his, a light but firm grip. Her skin was cold, but her touch sent a jolt through him, a warmth that spread from his hand up his arm, settling in his chest. It was a human touch, something he had starved himself of for so long. They stayed like that for a long moment. Two broken souls in a broken sanctuary, hands clasped in the aftermath of the storm. No words were needed. Her silence, his own choked voice, found a common language in that simple touch. He saw her lips move, forming silent words. And this time, he knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in his bones, that she was praying. Not for the chapel, not for herself. She was praying for him, for his soul. The realization was like a physical blow, knocking the last vestiges of his anger, his bitterness, out of him. He, Silas, the ash bringer, the man who had reveled in destruction, was being prayed for by a mute woman in a ruined church he had come to burn. The sheer, unmerited grace of it was overwhelming. A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped his eye and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He pulled his hand away gently, not in rejection, but because the intimacy of the moment was almost too much to bear. He felt raw, exposed, his carefully constructed defenses washed away by the storm and her silent compassion. He stood up, his body protesting, and walked towards the gaping hole where the altar roof had collapsed. Stars were beginning to prick the clearing sky, cold and distant. The air was clean, washed by the rain, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. He breathed it in, a long, shuddering breath. He felt empty. But it wasn't the hollow emptiness of rage and despair he was used to. It was a different kind of emptiness, a clean slate, terrifying and yet strangely liberating. He turned back to look at Alara. She was still kneeling, watching him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. He knew he couldn't stay. The law was still after him. His past was a shadow that would always follow. But he also knew he couldn't go back to being the man he was when he arrived. Something had shifted, broken loose within him. The fire he carried was not extinguished, but it had changed. It no longer burned with destructive fury. It was a small, flickering ember now, a pilot light of something new, something fragile and uncertain. Hope, perhaps, or just the first stirrings of a desire to be more than a ghost, more than an agent of destruction. He walked to the pile of debris near the wall, the timbers they had used for bracing. He picked up a smaller, sturdy piece of wood, relatively dry. He found his knife, the one he used for cutting tinder, for survival. For a long moment, he just held the wood, feeling its grain, its weight. Then, slowly, he began to carve. Not with any particular skill. He was no craftsman like Lily's grandfather. But with a focused intensity. He carved away the splinters, smoothed the rough edges. He wasn't sure what he was making, or why. He just felt the need to create something, however small, however imperfect, with the same hands that had brought so much ruin. Ilara watched him, her silence, a steady presence. She didn't approach, didn't interrupt. She simply bore witness. As the first true light of dawn touched the ravaged chapel, painting the scene in soft grays and pale golds, he finished. He held it up. A bird. A crude, misshapen bird. Nothing like the delicate carvings Lily used to make. But it was recognizable. A symbol of flight, freedom, or just a memory, an offering. He walked to the broken altar, where her small stone and tattered feather lay. He placed his wooden bird beside them. A third offering, his own. He looked at it, then at Alara. Her eyes were fixed on the bird. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor went through her. Her lips parted, as if she might speak, but no sound came. Instead, she slowly reached out and touched the wooden bird, her fingers tracing its rough form with a tenderness that made his throat ache. He had to leave. Now. Before the fragile peace of this moment shattered, before he lost the nerve, he turned towards the door, the one he had entered with such dark intent. He didn't look back as he stepped out of the chapel, into the cool, clean air of the new morning. The devastation wrought by the storm was evident everywhere. Fallen trees, scattered debris, the landscape scoured and raw, but the sun was rising, painting the eastern sky with promise. He walked away from the ruined chapel, away from the abandoned town. He didn't know where he was going. He had no plan, no destination. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril. He was still a fugitive. The past could not be unwritten. But something had changed. The fire in his belly was banked low, no longer a raging inferno demanding fuel, but a quiet warmth, a flicker of something akin to hope. He thought of Alara, her silent strength, her unmerited grace, her prayer. He carried it with him, a fragile ember in the wilderness of his soul. He knew he would never burn another church. He might never be able to fully atone for the lives he had touched with fire, for Lily. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could stop adding to the darkness. Perhaps he could learn to build, to nurture, however crudely, however small the gesture. The path to redemption, if such a path existed, was long and arduous. He might never find it. But for the first time, in what felt like an eternity, he felt the urge to try. He walked on, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape, leaving behind the broken chapel and the mute woman who had, in her own way, saved him from himself. The sun climbed higher, its light falling on the small wooden bird resting on the dilapidated altar beside a stone and a feather. A silent testament to a storm weathered, a fire unlit, a soul unexpectedly touched. The wind, gentler now, whispered through the ruins, carrying not a threat, but a quiet sigh of possibility. Perhaps some fires were meant to be doused, not by water, but by a rarer element, a prayer unheard, yet profoundly felt. And in the silence of a broken sanctuary, a mute woman continued her vigil, her spirit, like the stubborn spire, still reaching for a distant, perhaps not entirely absent, heaven. He came to burn the church but found a woman who prayed for his soul instead, and in that, perhaps a different kind of fire was kindled, one that might, in time, illuminate a path out of the ashes. We are all, in our own ways, seeking sanctuary, are we not? Sometimes we find it in the most unexpected ruins, in the most unlikely souls.